Did you ever hear about the German POWs that escaped from the POW camp in Phoenix, Arizona in 1944? This is the story of how the Germans escaped the POW camp. This is an account by Ronald H. Bailey. This has all the details of what happened, and it's pretty funny. So the first Germans arrived at Papago Park, 6 miles east of Phoenix, in January of 1944. They were placed in a half a dozen compounds in the rough-hewn camp, which had previously housed National Guardsmen. The German POWs had attempted to dig under without much success at camps in Colorado and Fort Ord, California. In Compound 1A, here at this location, it evidently began sometime around September 1944 under the direction of 4 U-boat captains who plotted a strategy while playing bridge in the barracks. They said it was a challenge and an adventure, recalled one of them, Captain Fritz Guggenberger, who had been personally decorated by Hitler for his exploits of his U-boat 513. The tunnel became kind of all-consuming sport. We lived, ate, slept, talked, whispered, dreamed tunnel, and thought of little else for weeks on end, he said. The site selected for the beginning of the tunnel was in a blind spot between the nearest guard towers. The entrance shaft was 3.5 feet from the bathhouse, which was the structure closest to the outer fence surrounding Papago Park. The diggers loosened a board on the side of the bathhouse to create a passageway and positioned a large coal box nearby to conceal the shaft. They would walk into the bathhouse to shower or wash clothes and then exit and slip down into the tunnel's 6-foot deep vertical entrance shaft. 3 groups of men worked 90-minute shifts during the night, one man digging with a coal shovel or small pick, and a second lifting soil into a bucket, and a third man topside, who also served as a lookout. A 4th group of men distributed the excavated soil the next day, or they flushed it down toilets, or stored it in attics, or let it slip through the holes in their pockets into the new flower beds and gardens. As the tunnel progressed, a small cart was fashioned out of a shower stall base to haul dirt back to the entrance. So soil piled up at such an alarming rate that a new means for getting rid of it had to be found. Captain Jurgen, a cocky Prussian who had commanded U-boat 595, came up with an idea. He said, "Shouldn't we have a sports area in this compound?" he asked. "I think they are supposed to encourage sports." Thus was born the notion of a volleyball court on rough ground that would need to be leveled. This the prisoners proceeded to do daily, spreading the soil taken from the tunnel with the help of shovels and rakes provided by the Americans. The guards got used to seeing a mound of dirt there, and they assumed it was the same old pile and not a fresh supply unearthed from the tunnel. The tunnel moved forward at up to 3 feet on a good night. In late November, a colonel from a visiting team of inspectors declared that the camp would need never worry about prisoners digging out. The soil, he proclaimed, was hard as a rock. He was standing right atop the concealed tunnel entrance at that moment. Prisoners who heard him smiled as if in agreement. The diggers intended to tunnel under 2 fences and a patrol road that encircled the camp. Just beyond the road stood an electric light pole and a clump of bushes. By triangulating on paper, they calculated the tunnel needed to be 178 feet long from the bathhouse to the pole. But someone wanted to double check that distance, so he attached a small weight to a string, and late one night they hurled it into the undergrowth near the pole. Suddenly, a jeep with 2 American soldiers came along that patrol road. Captain Hans Werner Krauss, skipper of U-199, watched in horror. He said, "That string caught one of them right across the neck," he said. "Fortunately, they were moving very slowly. He simply brushed it aside and said nothing, and the vehicle disappeared into the night." but the line broke and was still hanging on the fence weeks later. Several times the Americans walked by, stared at the string, wondered how it got there and why. So 3 other Germans were engaged in another novel scheme. Captain Wilhelm Gunther and Lieutenants Wolfgang Claris and Frederick Uzzolino had no intention of hiking 130 miles to the Mexican border, which was the plan for most of the escapees. Looking at an Arizona map, which I believe they got out of a officer's Jeep, they saw that they could walk only 30 miles or so westward and hit the river, the Gila River, which flowed southwest to join the Colorado River near the border. And all they needed to do was float down these rivers. All they needed to float down the rivers was a boat. So the trio was dubbed the 3 Mad Boatmen by their fellow POWs. They proceeded to build a flat boat big enough to carry themselves and their gear from scavenged pieces of lumber, and they fashioned the struts of a wooden frame. Canvas and tar for the skin were obtained from the camp under the ruse that the roof of one of the barracks needed repair, and the prisoners would gladly do the work. The boatmen designed their craft so that it could be folded up and carried in separate parcels, none to exceed 18 inches, the maximum width that could fit easily through the tunnel. So much of their work was done openly. Guards thought it was just another time-killing handicraft project. The excavators, meanwhile, labored every night in the tunnel into early December. The final 50 feet were the most difficult to dig, as the tunnel plunged as far down as 14 feet to go under a drainage ditch and the adjoining roadbed. Diggers worked by the light of a bare light bulb strung on an electric wire connected to the bathhouse socket. The insulation covering the wire was badly worn in places, and everyone suffered painful shocks as they bumped against it in the tight confines of the tunnel, which was less than 3 feet in diameter. On December 20th, the tunnel measured precisely 178 feet long. In the vertical shaft at the far end, 2 of the POWs pushed a coal stove poker upward through the ground and into the air. Then through a tiny hole, they pushed a stick with a little rag tied to the end. The prisoners on the roof of one of the barracks saw this flag appear in just the right place near the electric pole and let out some muted cheers. The completed exit was covered and disguised with 2 shallow wooden boxes containing dirt and grass to blend into the landscape. 3 days later, on the afternoon and evening of Saturday, December 23rd, next door compound 1B erupted in a noisy party. The non-coms there drank forbidden schnapps distilled from citrus fruit, waved a German flag, shouted and burst into Nazi marching songs. Ostensibly, they were celebrating news of Hitler's last gasp offensive in Belgium, the Battle of the Bulge. Under the cover of this diversion, the escape began through the bathhouse. The escapers proceeded in 10 teams of 2 or 3 men each, some carrying packs laden with nearly 100 pounds of spare clothing, packages of bread crumbs and other food, medical supplies, maps, and some credentials and cigarettes. Shortly before 9 o'clock in the evening, the first team, which included Guggenberger, descended the entrance ladder and began struggling through the tunnel on elbows, stomach, knees. They're pushing their packs ahead of them. So the escape had began. The 178-foot journey took little more than 40 minutes. Guggenberger climbed the exit ladder and cautiously lifted the cover. A light rain was falling, and he and his companion emerged into the clump of bushes and dashed down into the waist-deep, ice-cold water of the nearby Crosscut Canal. By 2:30 a.m., all 25 prisoners, 12 officers and 13 enlisted men, had exited the tunnel and were making their way through a hard rain outside of the wire of Papago Park. Colleagues who stayed behind closed up both ends of the tunnel. The general plan was to head south and move only after dark, avoiding trains or buses. Many carried the names and addresses of countrymen or sympathizers in Mexico who might help them get back to Germany. All knew that the odds of actually reaching their homeland were extremely slim. But for now, in the early hours of Christmas Eve, they were free, embarking on an adventure that surely beat life in captivity. That night, one team found a small, dry stable and rested along comfortable bales of hay, celebrating Christmas Eve with a meal of roasted breadcrumbs and canned milk, and listening to a Mexican family living nearby sing Christmas carols. Another team stumbled across a dilapidated shack and took up temporary residence. One of them had a harmonica, and he quietly played Stille Nacht, which, of course, in English is Silent Night. Back in Papago Park, the first real opportunity for American authorities to discover something amiss was Sunday's 4 o'clock head count. The German officers remaining in Compound 1A delayed it further by demanding that the count be conducted by an American officer, not a mere sergeant. It is only proper that as German officers, we have respect and equal treatment, one of them insisted. It was about 7 o'clock before it was certain that a large group of prisoners was missing. They telephoned the FBI to report names and descriptions of the escapees. While still on the call, another phone rang. It was a sheriff in Phoenix reporting that he had an escaped POW in custody already. Herbert Fuchs, a 22-year-old U-boat crewman, had quickly grown tired of being wet, cold, and hungry and hitchhiked a ride to the sheriff's office. Soon thereafter, a Tempe woman called to say that she had 2 escapees that had knocked on her door and surrendered. The phone rang again. A Tempe man reported that 2 hungry and cold POWs had turned themselves in to him. It starts to get pretty comical. One more call came that Christmas Eve from someone in Tempe at the railroad station saying yet another escapee had been arrested. This was Helmut Gugger, a Swiss national who had been drafted into the German Navy, almost certainly under physical persuasion from the Americans. Gugger revealed the existence of the still hidden tunnel the following day. Public reaction in Arizona soon focused less on the possible menace to law-abiding citizens than on the outrage over all of the provisions the newspapers reportedly found on the captured POWs, including rationed and otherwise hard-to-get items like cartons of cigarettes, packages of chocolate, coffee, sugar, and even 10 pounds of pork fat. One Phoenix resident wrote in the Arizona Republic newspaper, "Now isn't that a hell of a state of affairs when we, the tax-paying citizens, cannot get a single slice of bacon for weeks on end, and we come home from working in the defense plant and then read in the papers that the prisoners of war can get away with slabs of it." After Christmas, most of the remaining 19 prisoners hiked south each day as far as they could. On January 1st, 1945, a pair of escaped officers decided they could go no further. Captain Krause and his second watch officer on U-199, Lieutenant Helmut Drescher, had been covering up to 10 miles a night, but Drescher now had a swollen foot and was hobbled along using a forked stick as a crutch. In the morning, they approached an isolated ranch house and knocked. When a 12-year-old boy, trailed by 2 much younger siblings, answered the door, Krause explained who he and Drescher were and said that they wanted to surrender to local police. The boy said his parents were away, but should be home soon. The Germans made themselves at home, they brewed coffee, they shared their remaining chocolate with the children, and then regaled the kids with stories about life on a U-boat. When the parents came around at 11 that morning, they found everyone sitting in the kitchen. Their son hurriedly explained the situation. The father pulled from his pocket a folded sheet of newspaper with the mugshots of the escapees. He took out a pencil and looked at Krause and Drescher and drew a big X through each of their pictures. That same day, a Papago Indian discovered another pair of prisoners as they were sleeping less than 30 miles from the Mexican border. 4 days later, bounty hunting Papagos caught another pair asleep in the same area, and an army patrol from the POW camp at Florence nabbed 3 more. The following day, the 2 captains who had been first out of the tunnel, Fosslam and Guggenberger, were awakened by a group of Indian scouts. And Captain Fosslam asked one of the scouts, "Did you have a good sleep?" Fosslam was astonished to see it was one of the same men who captured him in Mexico 11 months earlier. With the capture, yet another pair of Germans. 2 days later, on January 8th, only half a dozen POWs, 2 3-man teams remained at large. One of the 3-man teams consisted of the 3 mad boatmen. They thought they made good use of their boat's canvas skin on the first day of freedom by sleeping under it and staying dry in the rain. But when they reached the banks of the Gila River 4 days later and started to assemble their craft, they discovered the canvas had shrunk in the rain. Then, after they shortened the wooden struts to accommodate the shrunken canvas, they found that the Gila River, which had looked so large and inviting on their maps, was more mud than water. As soon as they loaded their gear into it, the boat sunk to the muddy bottom. "We should have known that the Gila wasn't much of a river," Claris said. "Of course, everyone who lives in Arizona knows that." Over the following 2 nights, they succeeded in floating their craft for only short stretches on the river. Finally, the trio abandoned the plan that had sustained them through so many weeks of labor back in camp. They destroyed the craft and set out on foot. A week or so later, near Gila Bend, some cowboys spotted them washing their underwear in the bank of the irrigation canal and called the police. For the next few nights, the whereabouts of the final trio of escapees remained a mystery. The team consisted of Captain Wattenberg, and 2 of his crewmen from U-boat 162, Walter Kozer and Johann Kremer. Wattenberg had been a senior ranking officer in the compound and quickly built a reputation as the leading troublemaker by submitting extensive lists of complaints about camp food, recreation, and anything else he could think of. The Papago Park commander referred to him as the #1 super Nazi of this camp. After his escape, Wattenberg delayed heading south and explored the area. Kozer and Kremer even ventured into Phoenix one night, visiting a bowling alley and enjoying a few beers. The trio holed up in a shallow cave on the slope in the mountains just north of the camp, almost within view of Papago Park. From there, Kremer pulled off the most bizarre caper of the entire escape. Every few days, he joined up with one of the work details that were sent outside Papago Park. He exchanged places with a friend who spent the night in the cave while Kremer sauntered back to camp with the work detail. There, he gathered news and food. He would then either join a work detail to get out of camp or send food out with a member of the detail and remain in the barracks. On January 23rd, a month after the escape, a surprise inspection revealed Kremer's presence at the camp. The following evening, Kozer left the cave and made his way down to an abandoned car where friends on the work detail had stashed provisions for the trio. Instead of food, he found 3 American GIs with their rifles pointed at his head. Only Wattenberg was still at large now. 4 days later, on January 27th, Wattenberg ate his last piece of food, shaved, put on a clean shirt, and hiked into Phoenix. He had 75 cents in his pocket, most of which he spent on a restaurant meal. He slept for a while in a chair in a hotel lobby, and then, walking the streets during the night, he asked for directions from the foreman of a street cleaning crew. The foreman thought the accent was suspicious and alerted a policeman. By 9 that morning, Wattenberg was back at Papago Park. Their great escape was over, except for the punishment, which turned out to be surprisingly light. Despite the egregious lapses in security, no American officer or guard was court-martialed, and although some of the escapees expected to be shot, rumor had it that Germany had executed American POWs in retaliation for the bombing at Dresden. They were merely put on bread and water for every day one of them had been absent from camp. Still, it had been worth it. Years later, Clarice said of the tunnel, conceiving of it, digging it, getting out, getting back, telling about our adventures, finding out what happened to the others. Why, it covered a year or more and was our great recreation. It kept our spirits up, even as Germany was being crushed and we worried about our parents and families. So that is the story of the escaped German POWs from the Papago Park POW camp near Phoenix. I don't know what your thoughts are. If you like this kind of stuff, you like these stories, like and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.